Shabbat Shalom. So imagine yourself 40 years ago, maybe closer to 45, and you are on vacation with your family. You're just a young Sheva Milad, and well, this is before we had phones in our pockets, it's before we had even Game Boys or anything like that. So what you're left to do for entertainment? Well, with your family, you might crack out a pack of cards, and you'd play games. But if you're like me, at a certain point, your family gets fed up with playing card games, and they tell you, just go amuse yourself. How do you amuse yourself with a deck of cards? You play solitaire. You play solitaire. And as a child, I really thought I was terrible at solitaire. I thought there must be something wrong with me, because most of the time when I played solitaire, I didn't win. And it is a time-consuming game to prepare. You know, you'd go through all the steps you could, go through the deck as many times as you could, you realize you'd hit your point of nothing going to happen, and so you'd have to stack all the cards back up again, you'd have to shuffle them all the way through, and then you'd have to dun, 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 all the way to lay it out again, and then play another game, only to again not win. Incredibly frustrating game that made me think I was terrible. Turns out, once Windows 95 came out, and yes, I'm really dating myself, that if you have solitaire built into a computer, which will do all the dealing for you, so you can play game after game after game after game, it turns out it's not my fault so much as the game's fault. That solitaire itself, the way the rules of the game are put together, depending upon the varieties that you're playing, but the most classic Klondike version, 3-draw rule, you can only win if you are absolutely attentive and plan everything in advance, maybe even go through the deal deck at least once or twice to map out your moves. You've got about a 50% chance of winning. That's it. Because the circumstances of your deal will sometimes simply make the game impossible. If you've got all the aces buried under the stacks near the end, sorry, you're just not going to win that deal. Doesn't matter how much you plan ahead, doesn't matter how careful you make each move, it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter how well you avoid missing any of those possible combinations and moves and shuffles and reshuffles and backtrack. It doesn't matter. If the aces are buried, you will lose. It's not your fault. The deck was literally stacked against you. And yet there's still something about it that makes it feel like it's our fault, doesn't it? That there should have been some way I can win this. I mean, surely, maybe if I just... And that is what it's known in the psychological jargon as a fundamental attribution error. This is a classic piece of psychological research which shows that we overemphasize, as a species, the amount that we personally, or another individual, is responsible for the outcome of a particular situation. That it is more my fault that I lost than it is the circumstances of the deck. That it is more down to my personality, my talents, my ability, than it is to how the cards happen to be distributed on the table. And there's good reason why we lean that way. One, it makes us feel like we have more agency than we might actually have. And two, well, it means we actually focus on the things that we seem to have more control over, how I'm playing the game, as opposed to just flipping the table because the deck happened to come out bad. So this error isn't a great thing to have, but it's certainly understandable. But where it becomes problematic is when we move beyond our relative estimate of how much my agency and the deck are playing in my continued losses at solitaire. When we move into more serious issues, such as the one on page 732. Who here was actually paying attention during the tail end of our Torah reading to a fascinating story that is often overlooked and even when paid attention to, often misunderstood. Anybody care to give me a summary of that story? I promise not to yell at you too much for the mistakes you make. Anybody notice that there was a narrative? We are in the middle of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, where most of the time we are firmly entrenched in mitzvah after mitzvah, ritual after ritual. Narratives are far and few between. You're not paying attention to one of the few narratives that's actually there, and a dramatic one. It's got drama, it's got rivalries, it's got death, and you missed it. What's that? The defective men. No, that's not the section I'm talking about. Did I call out the wrong page number? Hold on a second. I thought I had that remembered well. Yeah, 732. I was right. The one. No, it's not about the Sabbath. It's the blasphemer. Blasphemer! It is the blasphemer story. All right, so this is not a popular story to recount, unfortunately, partly because we are no longer using God's name in most circumstances. And yes, the word G-O-D is not actually God's name. That's merely an English referent, and therefore not subject to the rules of blasphemy that are being discussed here. This is talking about the actual Yud and He and Vav and He name of God. But this is somebody who didn't just use God's name, but used God's name in a form of curse or swearing against someone else or a situation, doing so in a most disagreeable manner. And of course, the punishment in the text is death by stoning. Right? We can talk about how stoning wasn't what it looks like, and that's a whole other issue. It was a more humane method of taking someone's life, but it was still a capital punishment. It was still the person died at the end of the story. I would think you'd want to pay attention to the kind of thing that might get you executed. So let's do a quick run through the story, because the fundamental attribution error is all over how we try to understand this. And let's see if we can't untangle it a little bit. So the basic story is that we've got Mr. John Doe, or as we would call him in Hebrew, Plony. We never get his name. We got Plony here, and Plony has, as we are introduced on page 732, an interesting family tree. What do we know about Plony? Who's his dad? An Egyptian. And who's his mom? An Israelite. Right? So his dad's an Egyptian, his mom is an Israelite. What does that make him halakhically? An Israelite, a Jew. Right? That means that he is Jewish. Very good. He is traveling with us. He left Egypt when the Exodus happened. He is right there alongside of us. We're all in the same page so far, right? Okay. Now, who does he get into an argument with? No. Now, he curses using God's name. That does not mean that's who he's in the argument with. There is another triggering element here. A certain Israelite. I love that JPS translation, right? It's actually the son of an Israelite, right? An Israelite meaning a generic Israelite, somebody whose father wasn't Egyptian. And that means that his father was an Israelite, his mother was an Israelite, he is your run-of-the-mill Israelite, and he and the, well, do we call him half Egyptian or do we call him half Israelite? Well, we're not so sure. But he and Plony somehow get into a disagreement where Plony then curses using God's name. Everybody's with me so far? All right. Now we get one additional piece of information about Plony. Well, more importantly, we get his mom's name. Now it is unusual for the Torah to give us extraneous names, either mothers or fathers. As we can see, the other certain Israelite goes completely unidentified. But Plony, we get to know his mom's name, Shlomi. And we get to know an important piece of information about her, which is she is from the tribe of Dan. She is from the tribe of Dan. And this is relevant. Why, Torah? Now, I know that many people get into the mindset that when they're reading Torah and they see what looks like a piece of extraneous information, They just write it off as, well, you know, people used to write bad books back in the day with all sorts of useless pieces of information. It just should have been edited out, but no bother. That's not how you read Torah. If God chose to make sure that her tribal affiliation would still be relevant by the time we are reading it almost 3,000 years later, then you better believe it's relevant to understanding the entirety of the story, which is not simply telling us a blasphemer gets stoned. That we already knew. That we already knew. Otherwise, he couldn't have been punished, because Torah is explicit that you don't get punished for a crime that wasn't known before you committed the crime. The mitzvot are only now being released, and you cannot be held ex post facto guilty of something that you didn't even know, that the community didn't know, that God had not informed us was a crime at the time. So we're not telling the story to tell us that blasphemy is bad. The story is here to tell us something else. And well, let's see if we can't see what that story might be trying to tell us by going back to our commentators and seeing some of the options for interpreting this. Because they want to answer the question, why did he curse? Right? This is an important story, apparently, because the Torah chose to preserve it out of all of the stories that happened during that time period. Well, it probably wants us to know something about why he made this mistake, why he swore. Sforno, one of the great early modern or late medieval commentators, Renaissance commentator, says, the clue is in his identity, because what do we know about him that is so unusual and so distinct that his father was Egyptian? Therefore, he came from a bad family. He came from a bad family. He was raised with bad values. His father would have corrupted him, because no true Israelite would ever curse and swear against God's name. Sforno obviously had a more optimistic opinion of the community than I think history has borne out. But Sforno seems to think that the Egyptianness of the gentleman was the reason for his cursing. Fundamental attribution error. It was all his fault. He should have known better, but he couldn't because he was half Egyptian. So what do you expect? That's just what they're like. Right? It's all his choice. He played the wrong card. That's why he lost. Commentary number 2, Rashi, drawing from much, much earlier Midrashim. Well, Rashi wants to account, as the Midrashim does, for all of the elements of this story. Because Sforno only explains to us why we found out the man was part Egyptian. Doesn't explain his mother and her mother's tribal affiliation, or that grit, that little knowing word vayetze, and he went out at the beginning of the story, which our commentators always try to account for. Went out from where? Where was he that he is now exiting, that the story begins? Well, Rashi, channeling the Midrash, says the following. He went out from the Beit Din. That is to say, this man, Ploni, the half Egyptian, half Israelite from Dan, went to Moses and said, hey, Moses, we're heading towards this land, Israel, and you have told us all that we must camp and move according to our father's clan. And that when we get to Israel, the land of Israel will be divided according to the tribes, and each tribe according to their father's clan. Well, what about me? My father is an Egyptian. What's more, according to the Midrash again, my father was the only other certain Egyptian that ever gets talked about, the guy who Moses killed. Remember back in the story when Moses first leaves the palace and he sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite slave? That guy, that was my dad. He was beating my father to death. And he raped my mother, which is where I came from. So account for me, Moses. Where do I pitch my tent? Do I go with my mother's clan, with the tribe of Dan? They've rejected me. They told me I'm not allowed to be in their part of the camp because I'm not a Danite. My mother might be, but I'm not because my father was an Egyptian. Well, does that mean I have no place in the camp? Does that mean when we get to Israel, I will have no portion? And after all, also, you killed my dad. My dad wasn't a great guy, but still Moses, the guy I'm asking for, you also killed him. And Moses' response was, man, sucks to be you. I guess you're just out of luck. Because, yeah, the tribes are the tribes and the clans are the clans, and it is entirely patrilineal. So, yeah, you're just going to have to pitch your tent somewhere outside of any of the other tribal areas. And when we get to Israel, no, you're not going to inherit any land. You get nothing. You get to be with us. You get to be Jewish. But as far as like what your inheritance will be, yep, bubkis if Yiddish had been invented. And then the guy went out of that court, threw up his hands, turned to the other members of the tribe of Dan, the certain Israelite, and said, this is what I think of your God if this is how you're going to treat me. And blasphemed at that moment. Yes, I saw a hand.
I was going to say, Rabbi, I find something kind of interesting about this story. I see a parallel actually with Cain and Abel.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know the Holy Arizal said that it was postulated that the Egyptian was reincarnation of part of Cain's soul. So in a way, this is almost like a reenacting of the story of Cain.
Well, there is definitely an element of envy, we could say, that is going on here. But let's for a moment not throw him under the bus, as many commentators do, as being irrevocably harmed spiritually by his parentage or his reincarnation ideas, which are mostly foreign to Judaism, to be honest. And look at what the actual Midrash was trying to tell us. No, he didn't behave this way because his dad was Egyptian. He behaved this way because the community was treating him like his dad was Egyptian. That the community was refusing to find an accommodation, refusing to find room for this man who had walked out of Egypt alongside his mom, had sung at the sea, had come all this way and heard Torah at Mount Sinai. And now he's being told there's no place for you. Well, there is a place for you, but it's going to be real second class. You know, maybe you can be a potter or something, but you're not going to be a farmer, which is the only way to guarantee your own self-sufficiency in the ancient world. That was pretty much it, because you're not getting land. I suppose you can work on somebody's farm. Maybe someone will take you on as a hired hand. And can we not understand why he would blaspheme at that point? What good is God doing for him by dragging him out into the desert? What good is the community doing to him by telling him he has nowhere to pitch his tent? But he is technically Jewish, so he does still kind of have to go along for the ride, because to turn his back on everything else now would also be a tragedy. He has been dealt a terrible hand, and now he is railing about it.
Just so I'm clear, this is still Rashi.
This is all Rashi based off the much earlier Midrash. Rashi often, 70 to 80% of the time, is paraphrasing earlier Midrashim that he has selected as what he feels is the most representative explanation of a particular passage in the Torah. So, yeah, Rashi says the guy was mad. He was mad because he just got essentially jilted in court. Because all he wanted to do was pitch his tent with his mother's family, with the rest of the tribe of Dan. And the tribe of Dan would not share. Because the tribe of Dan is a tribe of din, is a tribe of judging, of being judgmental. The word Dan comes from the same word as judgment in the Hebrew. And again, the Midrash makes much of their attitude towards him. That they could have found an accommodation. It didn't have to be, yes, you get a full equal share because of whatever, but they could have found a way to have helped him have space, to have settled. They could have gifted him from their own allocation, even if he had not been, in quote, deserving of it from his father's clan. Nonetheless, Dan itself could have chosen to give him much more. They didn't have to leave him in this limbo state. And with that reading, which, like I said, is from the Midrash, we end up saying, okay, he played his hand badly, because blasphemy is not the answer. But we also have to recognize that he was dealt about the worst hand he could possibly be dealt. And his outburst is understandable, even if still inexcusable. That his circumstances did put him in a position where he was ripe for this sort of behavior. He was not choosing it from all of the hundreds of choices available to him. It was not merely his personality that led him to this place. The circumstances pushed him into a corner and he snapped. Now, that is still incorrect. Judaism still holds people responsible for their transgressions, even when their transgressions are a result of horrible circumstances. You can't say, Your Honor, I was having a really, really bad day. That's why I stole $500 from the 7-Eleven on my way home. Even if you were having the worst day imaginable, you don't get to be a thief in those moments. So, he was dealt a bad hand, and he played it badly. Now, apart from reflecting upon this story of somebody from 3,000 years ago, we have to also understand that this has bearing on us today. Not just on the question of the fundamental attribution error in general, of how much do we blame ourselves or an other as an independent agent, and how much do we blame the circumstances for our own problems, and how much do we also attribute our successes to the circumstances that we have been given? Right? Is it every time I win, it's because of my brilliance, and every time I lose, it's because of my circumstances? That is the default for most of us. Right? When you do really, really well at work, it's because you're a genius. When you do it bad, it's because your coworker sabotaged you. Well, no. Says psychology and says Torah, that is not the way we do it. Instead, we have to pause. Any success or any failure, our own or someone else's, and untangle which elements are truly attributable to the choices that a person made that could have been made otherwise, and which elements are attributable to the circumstances in which those choices were being made that yielded only one or two likely outcomes because of the situation itself. Are we actually trapped in a bad deal of solitaire, and you're playing your cards the best you can, but you're not going to win? Well, the circumstances are stacked against you. Or are you in a great hand of solitaire, but you are playing it badly because you are impatient, or because you are not paying attention, or any of the other reasons, and you could have won, but you didn't? Well, untangling which is which is a big part of understanding and having proper empathy for anyone else around us, and empathy for ourselves. Because too often we blame ourselves for things that are beyond our control, and we also give ourselves credit for things that are beyond our control. Too often we will celebrate or we will castigate others for things that really we have no right to do so. Judaism says it takes a lot of time, a lot of patience. Something that the tribe of Dan did not have, and something that Mr. Ploney didn't have. That we cannot simply make a snap choice. That it all must be handled carefully, deliberately, without prejudice and without anger and rancor. But it's hard. We're not programmed to really sit down and think things through like that. We like to shoot from the hip. We like to feel like everything is understandable and in our control. But this story, in its obscurity, in its complexity, and in the small hints that we give that we have to untangle, is trying to teach us how to do this. Because we don't normally get all the information. We don't know everything about Plony. We are given a few clues. We are given a few grammatical hints that our Midrash has interpreted to mean as I have explained. But we don't get enough to know for sure that that interpretation is correct. As I pointed out, Sforno had an entirely different answer to the problem here as well. When we deal with each other, do you think we have perfect information? When we see someone else driving badly, behaving badly at work, succeeding at something that is wonderful, do we think we know the entire story? They make a soundbite that is clipped and then spread around. They put a tweet out and we think we know everything about them because of 120 characters. No. Fundamental attribution error. You are imagining that you understand a situation with imperfect information, and most likely you are erring on the side of punishing someone else because you think you know everything about them from the small slice of life that you have uncovered. We know almost nothing about Plony or the Danites or the Israelites or everything else going on. And so our Midrash walks us through one possible explanation. And if you can think of one possible explanation that is perhaps more generous, perhaps more sympathetic, use it. Investigate further, see if that's the reality, rather than err on the side of bitterness or envy, greed or anger. The Torah is trying to show us the repercussions here, because it is not only Plony who is punished in the end. All who were there, who witnessed what happened, are also held accountable. They also are part of the horrible repercussions. We are not insulated just because one person made a mistake that the rest of us would never have done. We recognize that their mistake affects all of us, and that any one of us could have been him. Shabbat Shalom.